So while we wait for the slides to come up, I'm going to correct Jim Cooper. He said there were about 200,000 users of Mobius. That does not include the open courseware from the University of Waterloo, which has about 75,000. We will likely double that this year and quadruple that the following year. And before I get too far along, I want to thank a colleague of mine from Drexel University, Bruce Char, with whom I've had lots of conversations about what I'm going to talk about today. So we've been teaching mathematics for a long time, since at least the time of Plato, 2,500 years ago. Some of my students think I taught with Plato. That's not true. So how have we done? Pretty terribly. Most of the world is innumerate. By innumerate, I mean they do not possess the basic skills of arithmetic or necessary for them to carry out their own duties, their own expectations. So it's just not that so many of us are innumerate, it's that many of us are proud of it. So if you go to a social gathering and somebody asks you, what do you do for a living? And you say, I teach mathematics. What do they say?
This was my worst subject in school.
Absolutely. How many people are willing to say, you know, I'm terrible at reading, or I'm terrible at sex? They're quite willing to tell you they're terrible at mathematics, and it's socially acceptable. But it's not socially acceptable. They're quite willing to tell you they're terrible at mathematics, and it is socially acceptable. Even though it's a huge problem for them in getting a job, it's a huge problem in civic society for people being able to actually know what the public discourse is, and it's a huge problem for the economy, but because we can't find enough skilled workers. So how bad is it? I would encourage you to read the most recent World Bank report on education. It's called Learning. It's pretty scary. Take a look at the chart on the right. The table on the right indicates the number of students who were not competent in mathematics, that's in orange, in a standardized test after 6 years of school. Let me be absolutely clear about what the chart is saying. It says that most people aren't basically competent after 6 years. In a direct quote from the report, for too many, learning isn't happening at all. Now, you might criticize me and say, well, that's an unfair comparison. Primary schools in Africa are not like universities in North America and Europe. I don't agree. I'm going to go through 3 studies of North American schools that indicate that learning isn't happening as much as we would like at North American schools either. Some of you will have heard about a book called Academia Adrift that caused quite a stir a few years ago in the North American sector. So the authors of the book carried out a study when the study involved 2,000 students. When they arrived at university, they gave them a test that's reasonably well known and has been used for about 10 years. And then 3 school terms later, they gave them the exact same scenario. The scenario was you were asked to write a report to the CEO of a company given a certain easily understood piece of corporate data. 45% of the students showed no change over 3 terms of school. That means they spent 1.5 years of their lives. Their parents spent 1.5 years of tuition at an American school. And the social system put in 1.5 years of university resources for no measurable gain. That's a problem, I think. A little more frightening to me, actually, is a University of California survey that asked students to self-report on how much time they spent in the classroom and doing homework. The average was 13 hours a week for all of their academic studies. I don't want engineers trained on 13 hours a week. I want the bridges I drive over to be safe. So I have to assume that something else is going on, and what else is going on is that learning is not happening. Waterloo has a large accounting program, so I have an interest in what happens in accounting. I was also responsible for the university's position on communication skills in our undergraduate population. In a survey of all accredited accounting programs in the United States, there was an overwhelming consensus by the instructors that they did not provide enough training for writing skills, basic writing skills for their students, even though it was required on the new professional examinations. So what I want to do next is talk a little bit about how we learn. I'm going to steal almost all of this from Richard Meyer and Ruth Clark's E-Learning and the Science of Instruction to give me some context for later comments. So the first metaphor that they describe for learning is to reward certain kinds of behavior, or reinforce certain kinds of behavior, and provide disincentives or punishments for other kinds of behavior. I used to work in a prison. We used to call this behavior modification. It works. It really works when you observe how people interact with their phones. If you go to a bus stop, people aren't talking to each other anymore, they're on their phones. App designers know how to reward users of their technology. So the reward-punishment metaphor really does work, but I think it's a little limited for the education market. The next consideration is adding new information to memory, knowledge acquisition. If you observe teachers, and it used to be my practice to go to high schools and observe high school teachers, lots of teachers, regardless of what they say, what they do is information transfer. And lots of educational software developers do the same. But I think that does not recognize the need for most humans for some form of emotional or psychological engagement. This audience, I think, is different. The fact that you're here tells me that you actually think differently. And that is, I think most of this audience would say, to learn something means that I have to focus, pay attention to some important fact or new knowledge. I have to work with it. I have to try and integrate it into what I know. And that's called knowledge construction. We know actually quite a bit about knowledge construction. We've been doing cognitive science for, say, 120 years, and there are some basic, I think, well-established facts. One is that cognitively we have two channels. One is a pictorial channel, one's a verbal channel, and they're processed quite distinctly neurologically. The second is we have really limited capacity to learn new things. Our working memory is volatile and small. Our long-term memory is actually pretty stable and huge, but our ability to work immediately with facts is relatively small. And that knowledge acquisition works best when we're actively processing the information. So that means we have to attend to or focus on the relevant material. We have to work with it in some way, disassemble it, reassemble it. We have to integrate it with what we know. And so Meyer and Clark focus on 4 key processes for e-learning. The The first is selection. Students have lots of content. They have to select the right content to pay attention to. And I think this is generally hard. So if you think of a calculus textbook and you crack it open at a given page, there's lots of pictures, there's lots of words, and relatively few students have the intellectual stamina to start at the top of the page, read carefully, and retain what they need for the 6 or 8 pages of a section. So what's important? Selection, I think, is basically a hard problem. So I'm a bird watcher. When I go to a new area like Denmark, I spend some time to go look at the birds in Denmark. Frick, it's hard. They're not the same birds in my neighborhood. And selecting which tree, which bird, which element of which bird that you need to focus on to separate it from a closely related other species, hard. I think it's harder, though, to actually work, rehearse with that information or fact. I've already talked about working memory being not such a revelation.
Sorry about it. Does it automatically.
I've already talked about working memory being relatively limited. So we have to be very conscious that we don't overload students. Now, think of a typical 15-minute lecture in mathematics. I'll blame the University of Waterloo, at the University of Waterloo. Many of my colleagues, at the start of lecture, will start writing in the upper left-hand corner of the board, and then write while talking to the board. Non-stop for 50 minutes. How many people can actually pay close attention for 50 minutes and remember what they're seeing? Especially if they're a novice learner seeing this for the first time. How many of us actually spend enough time in review at the start of one lecture so that students can remember what they saw in the lecture before starting on the new stuff? Realistically, in many of my observations, people start new and finish new, and then start the next lecture at the exact point they finished off the previous lecture. So, realistically, most of us don't have the capacity to work at that rate. And so we need to be conscious about overloading our cognitive ability. If you don't use it, you lose it. And so in memory, it's been really well established for a very long time that you will remember much better if you're asked to retrieve previously acquired information or knowledge in a new context. And if that's spaced out over time, you remember a whole lot better. So, my brief summary. E-lessons, electronic or digital lessons, should do the following. Minimize extraneous processing. Focus on making sure that the cognitive load for a student is not too high. Manage essential processing. Train the student, help the student focus, select the right stuff, and work with it. And foster generative processing. Not that they simply work with it in this instance, but that they work with it to integrate it into the knowledge that they already possess, to make connections with other pieces of their discipline. I want to go back to focus on the second bullet, is rehearse or work with new information. I want to make a sort of a lengthy commentary about it. The first is that it implies that learning is work. Now the messaging in most advertising now is exactly the opposite. Life is better if there's less work, if it's easy. We don't say in ads to buy cars, getting good credit for this car is hard and we'll make you work for it. No, we say, show up, if you can fog a mirror, we'll sign a deal and you can have the car. So learning requires effort. It's effortful. And we need to make sure the students put in the effort. But you don't want them to put in useless effort. So you need to find a way to optimize that effort. In some sense, it's an optimization problem. You want to minimize the work for a maximal gain. Learners who have just newly acquired a fact or some knowledge are very poor judges of how well they know that material. Almost all of you, I think, will have had the experience of a student coming into your office saying, I really know how to do this. I just can't do this problem. They don't know how to do it. And they're in general a poor judge as a novice learner of what they know and what they don't know. And that's a talent that takes some maturity and some humility. How do most students study? They take a book or course notes, they take a yellow highlighter, they read, they highlight, and they read questions that they did in the past. Statistically, we've studied this many times, that's how most students study. It's a disaster. It is empirically demonstrable that if that's the way you study, your retention after 72 hours is minimal. And maybe it's good that they do that just before the exam, so at least they have that for the period of the exam. But in practice, if you actually want to memorize stuff, let me drop that word memorize. If you want to integrate that knowledge with your existing knowledge base, what you need to do is retrieve it from long-term memory and work with it. And you need to do that spaced over time. There's a reference to work, but I make no reference to learning styles. Learning styles are very popular in places, but there's no empirical evidence that learning styles make a difference in what is learned. They may make a large difference in how the student feels about learning, but they actually don't make any difference in what is empirically retained by the student. So let's think about all of this in the context of a Mobius lesson that we're going to build. And because I taught linear algebra for 20 years, I'm going to use a linear algebra example. So we want students to learn how to solve a system of linear equations, a basic skill for a mathematician. The students come to it for the first time. We might begin by saying, here's a real-world example that we translate to a linear model. Well, that's useful because it already connects them to something they know. They might be science students, they might be electronic engineers and having to build a circuit. And so there's some connection between their discipline and the mathematics. Then we might say, in that Mobius lesson, go off and try it. See how you do. Well, that's good because that reframes the problem with knowledge that they already possess. That means they're retrieving their arithmetic skills and their problem-solving skills for this situation. How well do they do? In some sense, it doesn't matter. Because what matters is that they are retrieving that previous mathematical skill. And if they identify problems, in the sense of they come up with an equation that looks at the form 0 equals 0 and is completely useless to them, they've at least identified a problem, and that's part of active processing. If they actually come up with a proposed solution, they can enter it in Mobius and we can tell them right away whether or not they got it right or wrong. If they, in either case, they could easily regenerate another problem and go on. What other kinds of retrieval do we do? We say, okay, let's work our way through this and see if we can develop an algorithm that will solve all systems of equations. Now, not everything that we do will work. We want to make the problem simpler. Multiplying an equation by the constant 0 will make it simpler. It might change the problem, but it makes it simpler. And so then we have to think, okay, why did that not work? Again, to some extent, that act of multiplying by 0, some of us would say, oh, that's a terrible thing to do. If we think about why is that a problem, they're in the process of actively engaging with the problem. Retrieving some past experience to say, okay, we just wiped out some solutions, or in that case, added some solutions. It's that active processing. One of the things that I like about the Mobius that's to come, which fortunately the University of Waterloo has seen, though many of you might not have seen, is that click level data. We actually get to see what they're doing. We, in some sense, can infer their thinking from their behavior, their interaction with Mobius. That's worth a lot in understanding how people learn. So the idea would be to build content in Mobius that abides by those principles that we saw. We want students to select the right content, we want them to focus, we want them to work, we want them to repeatedly retrieve content over time. So we know a lot about learning, and we know that learning requires work. What we don't know is how to motivate a specific individual to do the work. If we had a good theory of motivation in psychology, we'd be filthy, stinking rich. But we don't know. And I could probably ask each of you if you've tried to change one of your own behaviors, exercise in the morning, or smoking, or learning a language, and how many of you succeeded? Well, I'm going to assume you're a lot like me, and you failed more often than you have succeeded. So, personal change is hard. When I think of us preparing content for other people, we do have one huge ally, and that's the teacher. And so we should think about how do we make the life of a teacher easier. So most teachers want to do a good job. They want to do a great job. But life as a teacher is kind of difficult these days. In North America, in grade school, it's really difficult to be a teacher, to stay in the teaching profession. The lifespan of a North American teacher, the lifespan of a Canadian teacher in grade school is less than 5 years. It's shorter in the United States. So life as a teacher is hard. How do we make life for teachers better? Time is what we're all short of. So, with teachers, let's help safeguard their time. For many learners, the single most important attribute of their learning environment is their emotional connection with a teacher. Study after study shows that dominates. In those situations where the teacher does not make such a good emotional connection with the student can still learn well from quality content, but that's often in spite of the teacher. There's a great study that shows a very strong correlation between university performance, or whether you get to university, and your vocabulary as a 3-year-old. The more words you know as a 3-year-old, the much higher probability you will succeed later on in school. And how does a youngster learn vocabulary? Overwhelmingly through frequent and close contact with a parent. Using a very old notion that we as teachers stand in place of parents, we also can bring that emotional connectivity to students. So not only do we need to safeguard time, we need to safeguard emotional energy. Now there's an easy way to do both of those things at the same time, right? If we can automate some of the more straightforward tasks of teaching, like marking, 2,500 students, hand marking 2,500 papers repeatedly, you might want to step off the ledge of a building after the 7,000th paper. So Mobius gives us the chance to help teachers by safeguarding their time and energy. So you're a teacher in North America, say grade 10, you have 40 students in your classroom. Of those 40 students, 30 of them are on individual study plans. And so you can't actually teach to the class. You have 10 students that you can teach to as a block, and then 30 individual arrangements to make for students. With Mobius, we can provide structured lessons that allow people to step through their content at a rate that's useful for them. We have forgotten as we age how embarrassed we might have been when we made mistakes in assessment environments. So giving students opportunities to practice without judgment, that they can do some practice questions and receive feedback automatically, again, safeguards time and energy, but this time of the student, not the teacher. So I want to talk about how we can do better. We know that learning mathematics is hard. We know a lot about how humans learn. How can we fit Mobius into that picture? The first, I think, is we actually have to be very clear about how Mobius fits into that picture. That means we have to do formal, controlled, empirical, replicable studies about first, what presentation techniques, what testing techniques, what metacognitive techniques actually help. And second, the long list of cognitive biases that humans are subject to. How do we support those biases that help learning, and how do we mitigate those biases that hurt learning? A basic research program. Jim already talked about data analytics. I'd like to reinforce that. We want to assess how the assets perform when stratified for different environments, and for that I mean weak learners versus strong learners, wholly online classes versus classes that are delivered in person, second language learners versus native language speakers. Also, we should save people time by, if possible, developing enough analytics to know whether someone is competent in an area, or they could use some remediation or some enrichment, and whether or not that would require an intervention. Now, I think intervention is hard to do well. Right now, it might be enough simply for the teacher to know this is a situation in which you should intervene and leave it at the teacher's discretion. Later, we might use artificial intelligence. But if the intervention is of the form, I approach a depressed student and tell them, do more questions, that's likely not the most helpful intervention. My own expectation is that we will see digital assets replace textbooks, but the teacher's still going to be the person at the front of the room, or the guide on the side. How do our Mobius assets work with the teacher? So let me tell you a bit about what Waterloo is doing. We've created a study group that, by study group I mean a group who will carry out studies that's independent of the Mobius team, so that we minimize any implicit bias that we would bring in. We've hired a data analyst who will analyze the data streams generated by Mobius. We do have some very large research groups in artificial intelligence and deep learning, but the banks got to them before we did. and the financial institutions have a lot more money than we do. And so they want machines to learn about how to get people to spend more money, not about how to learn mathematics. Lastly, and emphatically, we are very interested in learning about how humans learn mathematics. We are very interested in collaborative research. And I think amongst this audience, there's lots of opportunity. And I would encourage any conversations or invitations or research projects. We think of being partners. And thank you very much. Time for a question?
So you talked about the opportunity for students to practice without judgment, which I think is very important. However, anecdotally, it seems to me that students sometimes do feel judged, even when they're interacting with a machine rather than a person. I don't know. A hypothesis might be that we actually try to duplicate the grading experience in an automated context. We use ticks and crosses, checks and crosses. We award numerical grades, those sorts of things, which are exactly what the student undergoes when they get graded by a teacher. I wonder if there's evidence on ways in which we can make the automated practice experience feel less judgy to the student.
First, I agree completely. I have no idea how to do this.
Right.
But I think judgment is one of the most negative, emphatic, powerful experiences of a human.
This is one of the reasons they hate it if they get graded wrong because they've missed out a times sign that they should have put in or something like that. You know, if you're getting them to write little computer programs, then they don't mind if the syntax is fussy. But if the syntax is fussy and they're, as it were, failing on a technicality on something, no, I know that, but I just typed it in wrong. They hate it. Now, at some level, that's because they experience these numbers that they're getting as important and as saying something about them.
So I think that might be one of the earliest research projects we could undertake, is how do we reframe that experience of a non-test situation feeling not judgment. It might be as simple as telling them that this isn't for marks. It might be changing the symbols that we use. I don't know. But I do think judgments, even the word is a strong emotional word, and we need somehow to get around that. But I don't know how.
I agree judgment is a problem, but I also think it can be an asset. And what I mean by that is that sometimes problems don't have a right or wrong answer, and that's something that we don't see. I mean, for example, we did some work on Friday with some high school students where we gave them 2 job offers, and job offer 1 was better for the first 5 years, but job offer 2 became better after a certain time frame because the salary was going up at different rates. So here you have where students could both be right or both be wrong, whichever way around you want to look at it, but you create the debate, you create the learning experience, and the judgment is more just discussing the answer, why you could be right and you could be right. And that's something we don't do enough of, generally in mathematics.
So I think we have to be careful about how we use the word judgment as a difference in exercising my ability to judge a situation, whether for me this circumstance of being paid more in the first 5 years versus the later 5 years is good, versus the noun judgment,
Yeah.
thou art doomed.
Yeah.
I'm going to mathematical hell.
I agree with you, but we lost no mathematical integrity with that exercise. We could still assess whether they understood the difference between, understood how to calculate the sum of an arithmetic series of geometry. We lost no mathematical integrity whatsoever. but students were allowed to think in a slightly different way.
But if they're being judged, right? I mean, but for one of the reasons I think that conversation, oh, it was my worst subject at school, I'm terrible at mathematics. You know, one reason we hear that more often than I was terrible at sex, is that, actually I'm not sure how far I can push this on. All right, let's see how this goes. For many people, mathematics was always an arena of failure and judgment. Again, I'm not sure now where I'm going, but it was an experience of being found wanting and of not knowing what there was to be done about it. You're wrong. You know, it's and we are in this room are mostly the exceptions for whom that wasn't the experience of mathematics in the classroom, but for most it was. And if we replicate those structures when we do automated testing, then we will replicate those outcomes.
We'll make them feel worse faster.
Yeah. Or cost effective way.
I think on that note about being known to be worse faster in sex, I think I'll end.
Sorry for lowering the tone a bit.